14 of the fantasy football season. And now here's a few defense DST units I would look to get on the wire this week. The first one, the Los Angeles Chargers. So the Chargers came up with a big game fantasy-wise versus Joe Burrow and the Cincinnati Bengals in Week 13. A huge game, 22 points allowed, 6 sacks, 2 interceptions, 2 fumble recoveries, including a pick six that pretty much put the game away. So I know the Chargers, their defense hasn't been good this season. I know Nick Bosa got banged up in this one and went to the locker room early. So the last few weeks for the Chargers, Week 11 versus Pitt, 37 points allowed, 3 sacks in that one. Week 12 at Denver, 22 points allowed, a sack an inning though. And then the big ball game at Cincinnati, like I mentioned, where they had 6 sacks, 22 points allowed, 2 windows, a pick six, and 2 fumble recoveries. So Week 14, another pretty good matchup versus the New York Giants. Even if Daniel Jones is starting or not, I still think this Charger unit could do some work and put up points. And right now they're available in 74% of fantasy leagues. The next defense is the Denver Broncos. So the Broncos, if they're coming off a tough one with the Chiefs, obviously, you weren't really going to play them versus that high-powered offense. But right here, cupcake matchup and a great matchup, no doubt about it, Week 14 versus Detroit. So the last few games here for Denver. Week 9 at Dallas, 16 points allowed, 2 sacks in it though, fumble recovery. Week 10 versus Philly, 24 points allowed, a sack in it though. And Week 12 versus the Chargers, 13 points allowed, 3 sacks, 2 windows, and a pick six. So right here, I think they could have a good game versus Detroit. I know Detroit got their first win. Everyone was excited over there, no doubt. But I think here, this defense can make plays, even with no Von Miller anymore, where he's obviously on the Los Angeles Rams. So right here, I think the Broncos are a good fantasy play this week. Detroit struggling mightily, 110-1 on the season. And the Broncos, they're available widely right now in 55% of fantasy leagues. And it wouldn't surprise me if they have one of the bigger days in Week 14 on defense. The next defense is the Tennessee Titans. So the Titans, their defense has been hit or miss this season. And right now, they're widely available as well in a whopping 79% of fantasy leagues. So the last few weeks here for Tennessee hasn't been all that great. Week 10 versus New Orleans, 21 points allowed, 4 sacks, a fumble recovery. Week 11 versus a weak Houston offense, they didn't do anything, 22 points allowed. And Week 12 in New England, 36 points allowed and 2 sacks. So right here, this might be only a 1-week ad. Is Tennessee off the wire with a great matchup, no doubt. Week 14 versus Jacksonville, that gives up the 8th most fantasy points to defenses on the season. Right now, they're not scoring points. Trevor Lawrence has struggled mightily over the last month of the season in his rookie year. And I think, once again, they could have a good ball game here is Tennessee. And Week 5 versus the same Jacksonville offense, 19 points allowed, 2 sacks in it though, a fumble recovery and a pick six. So I think another good game along those lines in Week 14 here for Tennessee. And they're a good pickup this week. The next defense is the Seattle Seahawks. So the Seahawks, another defensive one-time ad this week with a good matchup. Week 14 at the Houston Texans that give up the 3rd most fantasy points to defenses. But the Seattle team had a pretty surprising good ball game versus San Francisco in Week 13. So the last few weeks for them, Week 11 versus Arizona, 23 points allowed, 2 sacks. Week 12 at Washington, 17 points allowed, a sack and a block kick. And Week 13 versus the Niners, like I mentioned, a good ball game, 23 points allowed, a sack, 2 interceptions, a fumble recovery, and a safety, and a touchdown off a fake punt from Travis Homer for 74 yards. So right here, Seattle available their defense in 77% of fantasy leagues. And I think they have a great week this week coming up in Week 14. And the 5th and final defense I look to add on the wire this week is the New Orleans Saints. So the Saints here, their defense has been hit or miss this season, but it's another matchup-based type of pickup with a great matchup at the Jets that give up the most fantasy points to defenses on the season. So the last few weeks here for New Orleans, Week 11 at Philly, 34 points allowed, 3 sacks, a fumble recovery. Week 12 versus Buffalo, 31 points allowed, 2 sacks and 2 windows. And to be honest, Week 13 versus Dallas, they did give up 21 points allowed, a sack and an info, but they held down a pretty high-powered offense for most part of that game until Tony Pollard broke out a big 58-yard run touchdown. But they held Dak down pretty well, I thought. The running game did nothing. Elliott had a bad ball game. And I think here versus the Jets, they're going to make the Jets have trouble. Obviously, the rookie Zach Wilson. I know they go to MetLife Stadium in New York, but I like them as a 1-week ad here for sure. Is New Orleans, and they're available as well in 55% of fantasy leagues. So that's a few defense DST units I look to get on the waiver wire for Week 14 of the fantasy football season.